Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to this careers evening for the Australian Institute of International Affairs. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, whose sovereignty was never ceded, and on behalf of all of us present, pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. My name is Alice Nason. I'm a councillor at the Australian Institute of International Affairs, and it's my pleasure tonight to moderate this careers evening called Reflections from Careers in International Affairs. We are short one speaker who'll be arriving just momentarily, but we will get us underway. This event is held each year and is an opportunity for people to hear from an incredibly distinguished set of people who have had long and storied careers in international relations in various faculties. For university student attendees, it's an opportunity to gain some inspiration about what your career could look like, and for others already with careers in the space, it's a chance to hear from experts who've observed changes over the course of their careers and see where this sort of strange and complex industry is heading as we face a more uncertain strategic environment where national security expertise is more sought after than ever. Tonight, I'm delighted to be joined on this panel by Ambassador Jane Hardy, a senior Australian diplomat who has held 4 ambassadorial postings and has a strong set of experience in the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs. I'm also joined by Rosie Keane, the Consul General of Ireland in Sydney, and we will shortly be joined by Dr. John Lee from the Hudson Institute. I'm going to keep my introductions very brief, as I want to give the panellists the opportunity to introduce themselves. But how this evening is going to work is once each panellist has provided a short intro into their career, their work, I will ask a few questions of the panel and then turn it over to the room. So please have your questions ready. And with that, I'll pass it right over to Jane to introduce herself.
Thank you so much, Alice, and everybody. It's wonderful to be here. I actually have an anecdote. I know Ian from many years ago. When I first came into foreign affairs, it was after having met a wonderful person called Sue Boyd, who was in Adelaide, where I grew up and went to university. Sue was hosting a breakfast event for the UN Society, I think it was called. I was working for Oxfam part-time and at Flinders University studying. And she said, afterwards she said, Jane, have you ever felt like working for Foreign Affairs and Trade? And I said, I certainly have. And she said, well, the graduate trainee program closes tomorrow, put in an application. So I got my government form from a funny building in Adelaide at the Commonwealth buildings, and I put in my form. And part of it was I had been involved in NGOs in Adelaide, Oxfam of course, but also the UN Society, I think it was called, and also the AIIA, or a precursor to it. And so I actually feel very indebted to the AIIA, which remains a preeminent networking of the most amazing kind. I think it's the only one really of its kind in Australia, and I value all the email feeds I get with the most wonderful papers and things that I can read at any time. It's really a beautiful organisation, which now is made more linked up around Australia. So I'm in Canberra now, although part-time here at the US Study Centre. I actually joined as a graduate trainee at the age of 32. I had been in academia for a good 10 years, and I had done 2 degrees and counting. I was on my 3rd. It was a lifestyle choice, I think, at the time, but it was a great mix, because I feel that foreign affairs and international relations requires a very broad approach to your work. You can do law, you can do economics, you can do history, you can do any number of things, but I'd say that the real mixture of academic approaches is good background for foreign affairs. And then I did my 2 years graduate traineeship. We complained bitterly because we weren't allowed to apply for our first posting. Ian probably remembers these days when Foreign Affairs changed its induction program quite radically, and we stayed in Canberra 2 years. But I was grateful for that because I learnt a lot about the Australian government, the workings of the Australian government, and the discipline of ministerial decision making, the way the departments based in Canberra spend most of their days servicing their ministers and writing submissions to the minister on policy ideas and policy proposals, which then are decided in our Westminster system by the minister. But it really puts you right at the heart of policy making, and I valued that. I noticed in some of your blurb about tonight there was an element touching on public diplomacy, and that was also very interesting to me, having worked in part-time in Oxfam, which was very good at public diplomacy. By public diplomacy, we normally mean the kind of outward-facing work that we all do as part of our essential skill set in broader diplomacy. And that includes events like this. It includes occasionally writing papers for publication, although that's not very common. And it includes using meagre funding, we're very badly funded on this front, to project Australia's values and interests as we serve overseas. So I've had 7 overseas postings, 3 of them cross-posted, so they were kind of squished together. You mentioned 4 at ambassadorial level. 1 I was at Consul General, which can be considered an ambassadorial level appointment. Some Consul Generals are in their home department and more senior than the actual ambassador. I've witnessed that around the world. And it's a very important post, and the intricacies of that differs for a Consul General as opposed to an ambassador or an embassy is that the embassy covers all the functions of government and the Consul General covers a limited number, but they can be incredibly important. And my last posting was Honolulu, where I was Consul General, and I was Australia's envoy to the US commands there, which cover half the world's surface and are the US's largest military commands. So, that was more like what I'd call a thematic posting. I wasn't doing much with Hawaii, as much fun as I had, and the governor was a great mate, but it was about the US strategic commands. That's probably enough from me. I'll let Rosie continue.
Thanks very much, Jane. Good evening, everyone. My name is Rosie Keane, Irish Consul General here to New South Wales. This is my first head of mission posting, and I cross-posted here from London, where I was Deputy Director on Brexit. So some people say this is a bit of a treat, this role, but my background, I suppose echoing what Jane was saying there in terms of, having diverse backgrounds. I started off doing arts in university. I did history and politics and sociology, and I had this notion that I wanted to be a teacher afterwards, and then I realised I had no patience and I'd be a very bad teacher, but I really didn't know what to do. I came from a farming background, a rural background, and diplomats were something I seen, James Bond or something, it was totally alien to me. It never ever came into my mind. And I suppose what I decided to do then, and was partially inspired by my sister who decided to go down the finance path, I did a number of postgrads in finance, and that led me into the private sector, and I worked for a number of years as a very bad accountant. I still have one or 2 more exams to get, but I suppose coming here today, like one of the things Alice said to us, we'll be talking about geopolitical or strategic events that happen. And when I worked in the private sector, it was around the time that the financial crash happened. And the company I worked for, it wasn't doing very well anyway, but the GFC was the final nail in the coffin. We were all made redundant. And that was a huge, I suppose, jolt for me, and it really was like, are you happy? It really questioned what I was doing, and I remember at the time going to an expo about emigrating to Australia, and I was at the time, I was like, no, I can't do that. But what it did do, I suppose, I started, looking for another job, and I ended up applying for a role in our Department of Finance, so it was our Treasury, and that was a really challenging but interesting role. So I worked on a lot of the legislation that was brought about after the financial crash, so in markets and securities, and it was hugely interesting, but very confronting though as well. You're talking about people that lost their houses, lost everything, but it was as challenging as it was such an incredible learning experience for me. I used to have to go to Brussels quite a bit, working with the EU, and just to see multilateralism working, it was just incredible. And I suppose then from being in the Department of Finance, I got to understand more about the system, the wider civil service, and what was possible, and then that's where I found out about the diplomatic stream. The Department of Foreign Affairs, I hats off to them. They looked, I suppose, at their diplomatic corps, and they're incredible, but they weren't very representative of what Ireland is now, modern Ireland. So we're talking about having more women, more socioeconomic diversity, more LGBT diversity, the new Irish that had arrived as well. So they embarked on a recruitment campaign, a nationwide recruitment campaign, and they recruited like a pretty diverse list, but very representative. I'm going to say that I was one of them that came in, and my first role, I thought, given my background in finance, that they would put me into the economic diplomacy. No, they put me into disarmament and non-proliferation, which I had no experience in. But that's the thing about foreign affairs. You're never going to be an expert, I find, anyway, in our system, but you have to be okay with just, there's always a learning curve. There's always, you have to be very adaptable and be open to change. So my first role was in disarmament and non-proliferation. And again, there was a lot of that work in the multilateral system at the UN and in the EU as well. And then when Brexit happened, it was around the time of my first posting, and I was sent to London to do Brexit. I can talk about that after a while. Again, that was something, it was very challenging as well, but incredible professional experience for me, personal experience as well, very challenging. And then from there, to round it off, I cross-posted into Sydney, my first head of mission posting, and like Jane was saying there, Consul Generals, for us, we have Consul Generals. We have quite a few in the States, and in Australia we're opening another one now in Melbourne. And for us here, Sydney is it's like another country for us. We have a huge diaspora here. There's about 30,000 Irish born and 700,000 in our diaspora here in New South Wales alone. And New South Wales, I'm sorry to anyone who's not from New South Wales, but we very much look on it as the economic powerhouse of Australia. So a lot of Irish companies that are seeking to get into the broader Asia-Pacific region, they'll come here because it's common law, English speaking. It's very similar, I suppose, work culture. So it's a gentle, I suppose, well, it's not not always, but it is, I suppose, a good place to start off. So for so many reasons, it's so important to us from a consular community perspective, commercial, and then, of course, we have the culture, and culture, we can talk about that a little bit later, but culture is such an important part of our diplomatic, I suppose, toolkit, and it's something that we do quite a lot of here. But I'll leave it there, and I'll hand over to John.
Thank you. First, apologies for being late, and I couldn't get a chance to talk to some of you. My Uber driver from Paddington took me to Milson's Point, not Miller's Point, and so I had to cross the bridge back. But I'm here, so thank you all for your time. Look, my career is, even though it is in foreign affairs, is quite different to Rosie's and Jane's in some respects. My first degrees were bachelor's in philosophy and law. I did a master's and doctorate in international relations. But when I first finished my doctorate in England, in Oxford, I came back to Australia. I started my own business. And to be upfront, I did that to make some money, which is why you start your own business. And I always had a sort of timetable of 6 or 7 years. And in a sense, that sort of worked out well enough. And after I sort of disposed of my business, I decided to get into the foreign affairs field, and the first way I did that was through writing for newspapers, doing some work for think tanks, And I've kept doing that. I'm now a senior fellow at Hudson Institute in America, in Washington, DC, even though I'm based in Sydney. I do some consulting work for national security agencies in the United States and in Australia still. My only formal time in government was about 2.5 years as Foreign Minister Julie Bishop's senior advisor. So a lot of my work is very public-facing. It's engaging with media, it's writing publicly, but it's also still involved in government in the consulting roles that I have. I also have informal consulting roles with the with political leaders in the United States and in Japan and to some extent Australia. So I know that's quite a bit to unpack, but I'm happy to sort of go into various pathways of how I got to where I got to and any sorts of advice or insights that may be helpful to you. So I'll stop there, but I'll see where you guys want to take the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much for bearing with our single microphone. I'd really like to elaborate on some of the remarks you've each just given about what incredibly fascinating and different careers. Firstly, to Jane, as someone who served as ambassador in Spain, but also to Equatorial Guinea and has had senior diplomatic roles in the United States, I'm interested in what distinctions were striking to you in representing Australian interests in different parts of the world. How did the type and impact of your work vary as you sort of vary the region in which you're operating in?
Oh, such a good question. I was also cross-posted to Andorra as part of my duties from Spain, the Spanish-speaking countries. So the posting to Spain is a very traditional one. Spanish companies had been flooding into Australia after the global financial crisis. From 2012, 2013, 2014, there were about one a month establishing in Australia, and 10 years later I was very happy to see that most of them were still here. They had localised. A lot of my work with Spain was to do with the G20, with business leaders, with the enormous investments taking place as Spanish companies came here, amongst the world's best construction companies, two of the world's biggest banks, even though the global financial crisis was a banking crisis at its heart. It is, the dynamic of the crisis was much better understood from a place like Spain and possibly other parts of Europe where there was great contagion. I'd preceded that posting by being in Washington as head of our congressional office there, and I remember one K. Rudd coming as a newly minted Prime Minister, and he was so impressive speaking to Congress. So the congressional leadership came together, House and then Senate, with people around a table, all the names you know. Nancy Pelosi was chairing the meeting, and he gave the most brilliant description of the contagion of the financial crisis, which actually had its origins partly also in the United States with the housing and loan sort of crisis. It was a repeat of what had happened historically in the United States. So, I mean, interesting to compare and contrast those going from Washington, where my role was one of many in a very big organisation, the embassy. We had about 200 staff in the building. We had about another 200 off-site, embedded into the US system in various ways. But my little team, we were unique. I had all American staff. Some of them were Australians who'd become American. They'd all worked on the Hill. And so that was a very different kind of job. We were like underpaid lobbyists compared to what others make, right, John? We were strategists. I worked with Dennis Richardson, our ambassador, for my entire 4.5 years there, on identifying looming issues coming up through Congress which can bite you and you have no idea it's coming. We had done the FTA that had been landed by my predecessors, and then we were rolling it out and trying to offset some issues coming up in the Congress, one being strident or stringent potential changes to the foreign investment laws in the United States, CFIUS, and Dubai Ports World, which it's a very complicated world, the commercial and the corporate world, but it had a very significant Australian component, and so we were lobbying against the proposed changes. That was because of the word Dubai in the title of the company, and there was anti-Islamic sentiment on the Hill due to post 9/11, of course, and the terrorism that rolled out still in those years. So that was one part of it, taking K-Rudd and other leaders from Australia up to the Hill, hearing them espouse the interests of Australia. We were so proud of them. The American leadership on the Hill was very, very generous towards us. And this is a place where every minute counts, and you only walk into a room when you've got something to transact. And so we were very focused. Dennis was a past master at all of that, so I was very grateful to work in that environment. We also had 17 attached agencies in the Australian Embassy. I won't go through them all, but everyone's there. It's mini Canberra. I worked with all of them because most sectors, something will come up in the Congress in any moment. And so I'd get to know them. We did vast spreadsheets of who's who in the zoo, where are the committees, where are the key people, who are our allies, and who are our potential problem people. That's a highly classified document. But the interesting thing was, about 5 years later, I was US branch head, and I went back to Washington a few times, and my Treasury colleague brought out this funny old list, and it was who's who in the zoo, and I knew by the typeface that it was the one we had put together, and so they'd kept it going. Anyway, so that was one thing, and we were there to lobby the US superpower, economic superpower, going through huge ructions with the demise of Lehman Brothers and other institutions, to make sure that it didn't affect Australia's specific interests in maintaining an open investment regime, for example, in the United States. Westfield was the second, I think it was, largest retail property investor in the United States. In the whole of the United States, Westfield was the second, I think, or third largest retail investor. You know, we're all familiar with Westfield. Most Americans don't know Westfield. We know what it is, but it's all these shopping centres. And the Pratts, with their recycling businesses, had started to really roll out across the United States. And then Macquarie was investing in toll roads. And some, Iowa senator was worried that a foreign company was controlling a toll road in Iowa. A foreigner called, Macquarie. Who are they? It was really bizarre, but we had to keep on our toes all the time, and we were sort of manoeuvring constantly and just pulling in resources and information and influence from wherever we can, and that's the way it is in Washington. Now, Spain. Spain was glorious. It's a great superpower, very proud nation, was suffering terribly after the global financial crisis, partly because its secondary banking system was unstable, and most mum and dad investors were losing their investments. The banking system was going haywire. But Banco Santander and BBVA are two of the biggest global banks there are, and they were going offshore they were offshore, they're global banks. So, there was a completely different situation. Our interests in Spain were making sure that those Spanish companies following the money and coming to Australia would land properly, would understand the environment to which they're coming. My Austrade colleagues were really helpful. We had 26 staff in Spain and 4 attached agencies. And that was a smallish, middle-sized, not really middle-sized post, I guess, small to middle-size. But Spain was an invited guest to the G20. Kevin Rudd was promoting the G20 leaders meeting. It had really emerged as a significant part of our diplomatic toolkit globally. And we were hosting the G20 in Australia. Heather Smith was the Sherpa from PMNC. She played that role, and I would get material from my colleagues in Prime Minister and Cabinet to then translate it, have my assistant translate into Spanish practice, saying it all, and give speeches on Spain and the G20. And it turned out that Spain was a really significant contributor to the G20. Why? Because it was going through these ructions, and Ireland was the same at the same time. So Ireland, Spain, I remember Greece and Iceland were also held up as examples, but Ireland and Spain were the 2 big ones. But a lot of attention was paid to those nations. We were detecting other things in Europe, like the fact that Italy was about to possibly really go down. And that was very concerning. 3rd largest economy in Europe, Spain the 4th largest. You can see the huge effect that would have had. So those positions, the interests Australia had was from different sides of the coin. The environment in which we were working was different. In Spain, we are working in a non-English speaking environment. You must have quite good Spanish to be effective. The other thing happening there was our Navy was purchasing LHDs which are positioned out here on Garden Island now as their home port from Spain. I've been aboard both of those massive LHDs, aircraft carriers, from the time they were hulls with the hard hat and climbing up and down ladders, to when they were put on barges, one after the other, brought to Australia, commissioned, finished off in Port Melbourne, and then commissioned here at Garden Island with great, wonderful events. And I could call on the Spanish Defence Minister. He was very generous with his time. We also were purchasing military aircraft from Airbus Military, which was based in Spain. And we had 45 Australians at Airbus Military in Catafo, which is a tiny little industrial place about an hour north of Spain. And so I often had them. I had a beautiful old apartment in old central Madrid, and we'd have all of our aircraft people there and their families and all sorts of things. So, I mean, it was more like being outposted. Washington was more like being in a massive embassy in mini Canberra operating in the new Rome. But the skills I believe that I put into practice were those I'd learnt in my earlier career, observing wonderful heads of mission and ambassadors and other senior people operating, understanding how to focus, what's important, how to consult, putting together a case and implementing it, taking it forward with influence. And that's the heart of diplomacy. The public side of it's important, the business side's important, and it's extremely important to have your ducks lined up amongst your colleagues internally across the government.
Thank you so much, Jane. Rosie, over to you now. I wanted to touch on something you mentioned in your remarks, which is the importance of being flexible in an industry like this that evolves so quickly and the type of work changes for causes beyond your control. As someone who sort of had a career that wheeled from non-proliferation to Brexit to Euro-Atlantic to Indo-Pacific connections, I'd be interested in how you think about reconciling what you're passionate about and things that you have sort of deep interest in, things you feel like you have expertise in, with rising to meet the needs of the moment, and how you sort of stay passionate about the work when you're sort of something's dropped on your desk.
Gosh, that's very good. That's a good question. Let me think. I think definitely. I think in diplomacy, well, for me anyway, like it can be challenging. Like you know, sometimes when you see diplomats, you're like, oh, it can't be too hard. Like living here in this beautiful city and things like that. But if you have families, or you know, there's a lot of moving around, so I think there has to be an element of, you know, loving what you do, and there's some aspects I'm more comfortable with than others. So one of the things I always really liked was I love policy. Well, as much as anyone loves policy, but I do kind of like getting into the weeds on things. And one of the things I actually used to struggle with quite a bit was the people-to-people thing. And it was because I lacked a bit of confidence in terms of, you know, if I was speaking to someone or, you know, engaging on a topic, I'd always like, you know, doubt myself and say, oh God, did I say the right thing, or did I represent that correctly? And that was a big challenge for me, say in London, and also, like I say, coming here, because this is a really public-facing role here. But I really worked on that, and I really forced myself out there and really, you know, made sure I had these one-on-one calls and did the things that I felt uncomfortable with, so much so that they became very comfortable, and now I don't even think of them. So I think in diplomacy you do all sorts of different roles, and that can be challenging in that, you know, you're going to be dropped into disarmament and be like, okay, now, you know, tell us about biological weapons. You're like, what? But it's fascinating though. Like some of the stuff we work on, it's, you know, it is so interesting, and it can be very challenging. You know, at the moment, like there's so many geopolitical challenges, and it can be quite frustrating insofar as you're thinking, well, what can I do? You know, what kind of difference can I make? But you can, and I think, you know, just if you are in, you know, if this is your career of choice, like just be adaptable, be open to change, be okay with not knowing it all, and challenge yourself. And I think especially, say, for women, I don't mean to speak on behalf of the entire female race, but, you know, I think we sometimes are very, we have self-limiting thoughts, and especially when putting ourselves forward for challenges, you know, we think if we don't have X, Y, Z, then we shouldn't go for it. And that was something I think held me back for a long time, and until somebody gave me the advice one day. They were like, just go for it, like what's the worst that's going to happen? And I did, and I failed. But it was the best thing that ever happened to me. And not that I can overcome anything now, but moving here, I moved here in the middle of a pandemic, and I lived in a chair for 6 months because I had no furniture or anything like that, and it was all brand new. But because I'd gone through those things and gone through Brexit, I never doubted myself. I was like, well, look, you know, if it goes to pot, you know, I can always ask for help, or there's nothing I can't turn my hand to. And I think just have that in mind. There's nothing so bad. Well, I don't know, we might have some horror stories in the world, but generally speaking, if you're sensible enough, you won't go too far wrong. But I just think, yeah, you know, be adaptable, be open to change, don't be frightened to take a challenge, and if you do fail, just, you know, build back better, and if you fail again, just keep working, get feedback, and work on what you fell down on. So is that okay?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Rosie. And lastly to John, as someone who's had a career that has spanned the sort of full expanse of what contributing to policy formulation and debate and research looks like, from academia to the think tank space to actually being in a sort of government office, I was wondering how you think about policy impact in these different sorts of roles, and as we increasingly litigate these major foreign policy challenges publicly, like AUKUS, like a future regional security contingency, I think the role of academia and think tanks is something that we're starting to contemplate more and more as being important into formulating policy solutions. So, reflecting on your career, how have you thought about the potential impact on policy in those different positions?
Thank you. Well, I suppose I mean, you know, because I have been in academia and think tanks in government and also public commentary, they seem like very different, and business startups, they seem like very different things, but actually they're not from a method point of view. And what I mean to say is, you know, the most useful advice I could give, I guess, is that, you know, if you're presented with a problem, a policy problem or some other problem, rather than asking the what question, that is, you know, what's happening, what is the problem, all those sorts of things, try to ask the why question. Why do we have a problem? And I know this sounds a little bit abstract, but the reason why I say it is because if you can answer the why question, why do we have AUKUS, or why shouldn't we have AUKUS? Why should we take a harder view towards China, or why shouldn't we? If you can answer that in your own mind, and then when you're confronted with a circumstance, you kind of have a sort of framework to confidently make the call that you may need to make. And incidentally, I would also say that about your own careers. If you know, don't ask what career should I have. Ask why should I have? Why should I want this career? If you can answer that, then you put yourself in a much better position to be guided by where you want to go. So I can say from my own experience with all those different sorts of things that I've done, you know, even though they're all quite different, the common thread through it all is that most of my work, for example, deals with China. And I, you know, right from the beginning, I asked myself the question, why should we have this policy towards China, or why shouldn't we? And why have I come to that decision? So whether I'm in academia or policy or public commentary, because I've answered that question in my own head, there's far more clarity for me. And the final thing I would say, more from a career point of view, in terms of making decisions, look, you know, obviously you guys will follow whatever path you follow, but the one thing, and this speaks to some of the comments that Rosie made, and I know this sounds a little bit like Socrates, I don't intend to, but you do have to know yourself. So for example, are you comfortable with having no job security, or do you need job security? Are you comfortable with structure, or do you actually prefer a situation where, you know, you don't have as much structure in your work? Are you comfortable with hierarchy, or do you despise hierarchy? Now, all those questions, my point is you've got to answer those questions, and if you answer that, then once again, I think there's more clarity as to which direction you need to go. So that, in a couple of minutes, that's probably the best advice I think I can give to that question.
Fantastic. Thank you, John.
Can I add to that? They were great words, and Rosie too. I'd just say, as a practicing diplomat, I've taken a sojourn away from diplomacy halfway through my career just for a couple of years, but really it was a sideways move that wasn't very far away. It was literally across the street at a different department. But the second track is so important to our work. We don't have the time. I say to young people, if you want to do a PhD, do it. Do it before you get sucked into the, you know, endless work vortex of government work at the federal level. It's the only level I can comment on. The workload is significant. There are never enough resources. We were exhausted all the time. I didn't do a PhD. I did a master's, but I was halfway through turning it into a PhD, and it just never got finished because your career can steamroll over you. Mind you, I got fantastic opportunities as well, but John, your work and that of your colleagues, Charles Edel and others that I read a lot, they are so important to our work in government. We try and keep up with the reading. We have our feeds. Don't get discouraged if you do go down an academic path and you feel no one's listening. You might never know that. Mind you, you can do that. You can feel like that in diplomacy too. You can write all these fantastic diplomatic cables, 3-page cables. I just loved writing them. But you wonder sometimes if everyone's reading them. And you do find, you go back to the mothership and you find, oh yes, someone's read them. Usually from ONA, someone in ONA, Office of National Assessments or Office of National Intelligence, they read everything. So, but the second track's incredibly important. The business community is incredibly important. in the second track there were different cultures. There's academia and there's think tank world, and I have heard some vice-chancellors disparagingly say they don't actually want to set up think tanks because there are enough of those, you know, or the endless op-eds and the non-academic papers. But look, all are important. All are important. We don't tend to have time to deal with theory in government service, but we should understand the great global theories that underpin the liberal order and the way we work and why we do what we do. So non-government colleagues become very important, and it's really, if you ever stay in universities and don't have much to do with embassies, or you get a bit of short shrift, it's just because people are overworked and have very little time to deal with their compatriots when they're overseas. Washington, we had wonderful think tanks. We could just walk down the road and see people, and we did that a lot. It depends where you are. Spain, I had a lot to do with think tanks, but the language is very important, as I said, so, you know, there was a limit to what I could do, but also my job was to really work with the President's office and understand how the politics of Spain were changing the policy settings of Spain. So the jobs differ a bit. You want to add to that, Rosie? You're nodding.
No, well, I was just thinking about, like, in London during Brexit, like, the think tanks were one of the most important stakeholders, especially in a debate like Brexit where it was very polarised. The think tanks, like some of them, of course, that, you know, they'll be funded by certain organisations and they'll have their own agenda, but by and large, you know, they were pretty balanced, and they brought this really important voice to the conversation. It was unbiased, and it just set out the facts. They were really important interlocutors for us.
As a representative of the AIIA, I am delighted to hear that think tanks have been helpful to you in your line of work. We've got about 20 minutes left. At this point, I wanted to open it up to the room. If anyone has any questions, please raise your hand. Otherwise, I've got about 50 left for the panel. So. You can call out.
Yeah. Perhaps just following on from that discussion we just had. First of all, thank you very much for being here. It's very valuable for us all to hear your career stories. I was just wondering how much license there is in the public service to not advocate for, but advance ideas that you have, and whether you feel like that has been a constraint that's difficult to navigate, or, yeah, just wondering if you have reflections on that.
Great question. Who wants to go first?
Well, I guess, I mean, I'll be quick because I want to hand over to either Rosie or Jane, because for me, my public service experience is different. You know, I advised politicians in the past, and I still do, whereas Jane and Rosie, they do advise politicians, but in a different way. Look, to answer your question, you know, everyone sort of has this idea, all right, whether you're an advisor to a politician or whether you're a bureaucrat, you're going to change the world, or you're going to change policy. Fine. But back to what I was saying before, you still, if someone says to you, if you advocate a particular position, I found this when on my first day in a job with Julie Bishop and Malcolm Turnbull. If you advocate for a policy decision, the first question is why? If you cannot answer that, then you shouldn't advocate for that position. And obviously then there's a lot of tactical things you need to do to sort of try to get your views, or at least to socialise your views across the system. But my point is, from in my line of work, yes, I'm not under a lot of constraints, but it's a contest of ideas, and if I can't compellingly answer the question, why do I think my advocacy for that position is better than someone else's, then it doesn't get currency. So that's my world, but I think the world of Rosie and Jane will be some similarities, but a lot of differences.
Yeah, just very briefly, I suppose for me, I find, well, in the role I had in London and the role I have here, I suppose my guiding star is always like, well, here, for instance, our Asia-Pacific policy or strategy. And you know, I always refer back to those high-level goals and, you know, interpret them into my business plan. But from there, I have quite a bit of freedom to interpret, say some of the goals and what I do here locally. So one of them is projecting, Ireland's democratic values. Like, so, say for instance, what I do is to, I suppose, implement that here. I have partnered with local LGBT organisations. Last year with the Women's World Cup, we put a lot of work into like promoting women in sport and things like that. So I do have quite a bit of freedom, I suppose, to interpret. And if you do go too off kilter, somebody will pull you back. But I think in our system, and certainly say with Brexit as well, because it had never been done before and nobody knew what Brexit was, you kind of not got free to, like, obviously I didn't shape how it was going to turn out, but you were given quite a bit of trust in terms of structuring my role in London and say what are we going to do. And so I think, again, just going back to, there will usually always be a strategy that's agreed by government. That's always my guiding star. And but yes, we do get quite a bit of freedom, and it is quite nice. You can, I suppose, I'm very passionate about gender equality, so I do a lot of work to promote women and women's participation. So that's something. But then my successor, not that they put that in the back drawer, but there'll be other things that they're passionate about. So it's we've quite a bit of license to do that.
It's such a great question. I always say really good policy ideas are the hardest thing to find, and good ministers will be looking for policy ideas. When we say policy ideas, you have to, as a bureaucrat at least, be very careful about how you approach it. As John said, the why is very important. That we have a 2-page ministerial submission. On the front page, tick boxes, yes, no, please discuss. And by the way, that often gets written on, and I've been in front of Penny Wong several times in the last few years, which were quite nerve-wracking, but just very important occasions. But don't ever think that you don't have agency. As a bureaucrat and as a staffer in a ministerial office, you do. Different types of agency, but the power of the pen is just so important. You'll never, unless I was really vagrant and released government documents to the public, which I've never done, and in which case I would probably be in jail. The power of the pen is so important to understand, and as you do your academic careers, remembering how to mount an argument is critical. Remembering or understanding the Australian political system is critical, so that you understand a minister has 5 seconds or 10 seconds. A staffer has put a note on top of the submission from the department. Penny Wong was one of those ministers who read the actual submission. Not all of them do. Stephen Smith was another one. Julia Bishop was a wonderful foreign minister, and I'm not sure if she read the submissions or not. But anyway, we got material through that process, which is designed by law and Parliament and by our political system, and it must all be done within that framework. So tactically working how to get it through the sausage machine is a great skill, and some of the wily old hands that I learnt from through the years have taught me a great deal about how to do that, and understanding the why, really articulating the argument. The key point has to be at the top. This is the art of writing submissions. The other thing, as a bureaucrat and a staffer and most political operatives, is that you will never be credited for your work, and you just have to accept that. There is no such thing. Your name's on it. You'll hear about it if it's not up to scratch. But in the public eye, you will never be credited with your work. When we do get our head of mission jobs, Rosie and myself, that is when we have been thought trustworthy enough to go out there and start articulating values and interests and influence the way we are meant to as ambassadors. and we have a fair bit of latitude there, and in fact bilateral work is thrilling because you can mount. I had 3 ideas for my first year in Spain. A new visa, got it with the help of the ambassador here. We worked it between us. The G20 I mentioned, just giving Spain more of a platform, making sure that they understood the emerging dynamics in the leadership of the G20. And thirdly, a guitar festival. I set up a guitar festival. So the guitar festival of Cordoba, one of the great Andalusian old medieval towns with the world's epicenter of Spanish guitar. The Adelaide Festival Centre director said to me quietly one day before I left, "We have a guitar festival in Adelaide. It takes place in June. The Cordoba Guitar Festival takes place in July. Could you help us create a link?" And so I did, and it was the most thrilling thing. And Slava Gregorian was the artistic director, and he came to Spain. And these are thrilling moments when you can actually, and that was my idea with the director of the Adelaide Festival, to set that up. And, they're the very important moments when you do see the results of your own ideas. G20 wasn't my idea, but the idea being that my staff should really focus on how we influence the Spanish G20 officials and business people. And the visa was a working holiday visa, which had just stagnated. And we did this in the United States as well. These are they're actually quite hard to set up. But we set one up in the United States, very different type of visa because the Spanish visa was of a certain kind. Wonderful to see that result. So it'll always be quiet. You'll never get the kudos. You won't be able to talk about it until afterwards. You'll labour away at it. You'll try and influence everybody there is to influence. You'll find a pathway through and hopefully secure an idea. It's always iterative, small steps. It's very rarely a big dramatic change.
Question back there,
Obviously you guys have had the opportunity to be in different roles in your careers. I just wanted to know, what do you think, personally, are the attributes that get you guys the opportunities to be in different positions?
I'll just quickly say my committee that recruited me as a 32-year-old graduate trainee will answer that question. But I think Rosie's touched on it, John's touched on it, integrity, flexibility, good ideas, and just willingness to work very hard across the board. I always say, so I did 33 years in Foreign Affairs, 7 overseas posts, multiple jobs in Canberra. The first 6 months of every single new position I held was like rabbit in the headlights. Just work very hard to get on top of the brief, pull in all the experts around you and understand what the goal is for that particular set of work.
I agree with everything you said. I suppose one of the things as well would be just to be adaptable and be open to change. I know that's kind of cliche, but when we think about it as humans, we don't like change at all. If somebody changes the computer system, you're like, you grouse about it for about a week, and then but change is a good thing. And in diplomacy, if you're back at HQ or you're on mission, you have to be flexible. You have to be open to change. You have to be, able to, know it's going to be challenging, and you're going to feel uncomfortable. It's going to be unfamiliar work, but just keep at it. Be resilient and know that you will get that comfort. It's like a new pair of shoes. After a while, they'll become very comfortable. Well, maybe that's a bad analogy. But I think definitely adaptability and being open to challenges, and just having courage and knowing that if at times you fall down on something or you fail, that's okay. Like, some of the best things I've done or best things I've learned are where I have failed, and I wouldn't take them back now. At the time, I hated it, but it's definitely something I think. Yeah, develop that kind of armour, and you won't go too far wrong.
I guess from my experience, I'll suggest two things, one substantive and one more tactical. The substantive thing is, when I first started my doctorate in 1998, every person was writing about transnationalism, right, because it was the 90s, everything was great. And then 9/11 happened, and everyone was writing about war and terror. And this was a new paradigm, national politics. Now, the point I'm making is that, try not to be captive to intellectual fashion. I mean, I benefited, maybe it was a fluke, but I benefited because I focused a lot on the return of geopolitics, China, US, 10 years before it actually happened, and it stood me quite well. Now, so the point I'm trying to make is just to say, don't be a contrarian for the sake of it, but try to keep ahead of intellectual fashion rather than being captured by it, and think through it yourself. But it does come with a warning, because, my observation is people don't generally get punished in their careers if they're wrong or if they've stuffed up. But they get punished if they're wrong, they're stuffed up in a minority. If you're wrong, you're stuffed up in a majority, you don't get punished. So that comes with a warning. So that does speak to a sense of courage, in a sense, and conviction as to where you want to go. The tactical element is, and this is just the way I approach things, in every workplace I go to, wherever it is, my first question when I arrive on that first day is not, oh, what's my job? How do I not stuff up? My first question is to actually work out the people around me. Who are the enablers? Who are those who are going to block you? Who are those who actually want you to do well? Who are those who don't want you to do well? And respond accordingly. And I know this just sounds very sort of folksy in saying that, but ultimately any workplace is staffed by people. There are good people that will be for your career, and people who will be bad for your career. Try to hang around those that, or try to make a judgment and hang around those that actually do want the best for yourself. And look, certainly I think that has stood me well. So that would be my advice.
Thanks.
Last question for the panel. Okay, then I will take moderator's privilege. This has been a really useful and informative discussion. I think for a room of people excited about careers in this space, I'd be really interested in your reflections on the trend or event or emerging thing that you think is going to be something that's going to define future careers in international security. With John's wanting to always try to stay one step ahead, I'd be really interested in the thing that you'd be closely following if you were about to start your career in the space.
I'm very aware of John's comment, can't agree more. I remember back a few years what we thought 3D printing was going to be create a big upsetting moment for whatever there's a lot of junk science out there you've got to be a bit wary of. But I do think that if you look at the OSMIN 2024 statement, it was a pretty weak statement in my personal view, but there was another statement attached to it that was about emerging threats to democracy in the form of misinformation, disinformation, and a strong declaration that the US and Australia were going to ramp up their efforts against this challenge to our soft power. And I think that's still one of the biggest threats facing us all and diplomacy, and it's facing the liberal order, it's facing democracies, and I think that it behoves us to understand the least little bit about AI, and I'm not a scientist, so these things don't come naturally to me, and understanding the laws that we're creating around this world. And I've written a piece recently on the European competition law, which is inadvertently, I believe, opened the gate for malign actors to come through to operating systems of each and every device that we hold, and to warn the world not to repeat. A lot of countries follow the EU because they are cutting edge. Sorry about this, Rosie. And the EU is a standard creator It's great value. I think it's a miracle for the world, the EU. I admire it immensely. And one of its great strengths is the fact that it has the power to create global standards. And mostly, we all follow those standards, everyone except the United States, mind you. But we often are influenced by what the EU does. In this regard, however, partly because it's right at the edge and partly because competition law is one of the three basic competencies of the EU, it's been done, I believe it will be revised and it will be changed, it can be changed. So, but it's an example of how important it is that our global system of communications not only operates technically and at a safe level for all users, but it's not used also to destroy our democracies, which I think is a very real threat.
Absolutely, and I would agree with that as well. I think one of the, I suppose, a trend or a threat, both, is that, I suppose, coping with AI technology, but in a world that's increasingly polarised. Like, not that the early 90s were the halcyon days where everything was wonderful, but you had more confidence in the multilateral institutions that solutions could be found, and that, you know, even in some countries, you know, like the States and things, there were issues that were bipartisan issues. That space and that for compromise, it's being whittled away every single day, and it is just, it's quite sad in a way, like that we're facing global issues. Like, so say for instance, we've seen the pandemic, like you couldn't get a more textbook global issue, but we did it in the EU. Everyone went down their own individual route, and, you know, yes, if you had money, it was great, your population was protected, but what about, you know, the countries that didn't have money for vaccines? There are certain things that we need global responses to, and I worry, you know, and AI and technology is one of those, but I worry that we're not going to, that's not available. It's everyone, I suppose, with polarisation, people are trying to take advantage, or, you know, where they can, and I don't see that changing anytime soon. Yeah, probably very pessimistic, but yeah, I think that's something to be alive to.
I'm going to point to AI as well, but this is my take on it. And look, I hope you guys don't use ChatGPT for your essays, but I'm sure you have friends that do. And you would know yourself that if you use ChatGPT, there's two things. The first thing is it's dependent on how intelligent your questions are that you input into the system, right? And the second thing is that it's very hard to get a high distinction using ChatGPT, but it's pretty easy to get a credit or a pass. Now, I'm making a broader point. A broader point is something like AI, which is, I think, it's not, unlike some of the other kooky technologies which Shane mentioned, it is here to stay. It's going to severely disrupt your careers. But I think the way it's going to do it is that it's going to be really good for people who are really good at their fields, and it's going to be terrible for people who are average in your fields. In fact, if you're average in your fields, your job may not exist in some context. So the point I'm trying to make is that AI is actually going to increase the gap between those who are really good at their fields, therefore those who are successful, and those who, you know, are not so good. And it comes back to something I keep emphasising over the last 45 minutes or so. If you can compellingly understand why your positions are what they are, you can deal with disruptions like artificial intelligence. If you can't, if you just sort of follow the trend without really understanding what's going on, it's really going to be tough for your career. So I don't know whether you view this what I've just said as something good or something bad, but I actually think this is actually what's going to happen. And it's going to be quite huge in our field. Lots of other fields too, but certainly in our field.
And with that, we're right up on time. So I'd like to thank you all for joining us this evening. It's been a pleasure to have this conversation. Our next event at Glover Cottages will be next Tuesday with Mr. Bruce Walpe from the United States Study Centre speaking about the American election. But before we conclude this event, if you could all please join me in thanking our incredible panel for their time this evening. Have a nice evening. Thanks.